So I'm sure that Guglielmo is one of the most prominent linguists of our time. And you know that anyway, you know that one of the main tasks of, I think, any science is to put things into some orders, and I think that Guglielmo is one of the main specialists in various orders. So let's start.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I hope not to disappoint you. Sorry for not speaking Russian. So I will speak English and I try to speak slow. Before I start, let me say that I'm honored to be giving this mini course here, and I want to thank Yura for suggesting my visit last year in a workshop in Milan, and then it materialized this year, as well as Natalia and Anna for crucial help in my coming. In this presentation, I will try to integrate some findings of so-called formal syntax in the generative tradition with those of the typological tradition, of the Greenbergian type that you are familiar with. Now, the focus will be on the internal structure, special focus will be on the internal structure of nominal phrases. In particular, I will attempt to reconstruct a fragment of the universal hierarchy of the constituents of the elements that make up the extended projection of the noun. By extended projection of the noun, I mean all those functional modifiers and heads that are within the larger nominal phrase. So numerals, adjectives, relative clauses, and so on. And they come in a specific order. At least I will try to convince you that this is what we actually find across languages. And I will devote special attention to the syntax of adjectives and relative clauses. But let me start by spelling out one particular assumption that I adopt within the generative framework, and that I will try to motivate. If I'm not clear or unconvincing, maybe for some of you, interrupt me, and there will also be a discussion period, especially at the end of the second class. But in any case, you can interrupt me, ask if I'm not clear. So, as you see in the first page of the handout, I assume, following Chomsky's work, you might have heard, of course, that linguistic inquiry aims at discovering behind the language particular facts, the facts of Italian, the facts of Chinese, the facts of some other language, the universal categories. This is by no means accepted by everybody. The universal categories that make up our faculty of language, namely the universal hierarchy, the universal hierarchical structure of the sentence and its phrases, the grammatical categories, principles, operations, that lexical features that make up our faculty of language. In a minute, I discuss some examples, some specific examples taken from the lexicon and one taken from the morphosyntax, hoping that it will be clearer what I mean. Anyway, any universal category that is reached through comparative grammar or comparative analysis, I take it to be not a convenient way of organizing the facts or the data, but as a claim to truth, namely something which is either right or wrong, or better saying, as in the more mature sciences, more right or less wrong than alternatives. That's the only way one can proceed. Now, this contrast, as you already thought, with another position, which takes the differences among languages at face value, assuming that the language-specific categories that you find in actual languages do not reflect any universal category, and that languages may differ ad libitum in arbitrary ways. For example, recently, I take it as an influential position in the typological tradition is that in order to compare what look like incommensurable things, given that, as you see in the handout, each language has its own categories, which is trivially true, but taking it at face value, it looks as if we cannot compare anything, because you cannot compare cauliflowers with pears, for example. And that one should resort rather to a special tool, comparative concepts, which are, and I quote, created by the comparative linguist. They are not psychologically real, and they cannot be right or wrong. Exactly the opposite of what I took to be the way to go. Now, this is not a logically necessary position to take in doing typological work. And in fact, there is, I quoted in the footnote 2 in the handout, there are also universalist, or at least they seem to exist, universalist position in some schools of typology. And I recently came across an article by two Russian linguists, Nedyalkov and Litvinov, which I cited in the bibliography, who attribute to the founder of the group for typological study of languages of the Russian Academy of Science in Leningrad, Alexander Holodovich, the statement, the consideration that, I quote, the theory of syntactic models and the problem of universal syntax as the underlying base of all individual syntaxes to be one of the basic research problems of the group. So in the early 60s, an amazingly early instantiation of a universalist position, he said that there is a universal syntax that underlies all the syntaxes of the various languages. So that is to say that this is a possibility to consider doing typological research. In fact, I think that we do not need comparative concepts, and that we should go from language-specific facts, and eventually we will, or our students, or the students of our students will be able to go to discover what universal structures, categories, operations, principles of the faculty of language are. Starting from, it's a difficult way to go, but starting from the facts of each individual language. Now, before taking up this plausibility argument in these lectures, I want to mention a methodological consideration which bears some similarity, big similarity to Pascal's wager. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's one of the demonstration of the existence of God. But I take it to the side. But this was actually at the basis of modern probability, his wager, and decision theory. So he was a mathematician. And mutatis mutandis, this means that it is rational to bet, this is the consideration, it is rational to bet on the existence of universal grammar as the reconstruction of our faculty of language, because were we not to proceed as if there was such a thing, we would risk not finding it if there is. So in his terms, if there is, we gain everything. If there isn't, we lose nothing. That is his demonstration. Anyway, apart from that, a possible relevant case that I will take up at some point, that I will discuss, is the possibility, for example, if you think that there is a unity underlying any of the constructions that we consider across languages, take the relative clause construction, that it's possible, I think, to give a unified analysis of the 7 types of relative clauses that are attested cross-linguistically. Of course, if you didn't think that there is a universal grammar, then you stop at that, at face value, and you take 7 types. But it's interesting to try to see whether the 7 types can be derived from one universal structure and some independently justified operations. This is what I will try to do. Let me make one last historical remark before I pass on to the facts. The 2 positions that I gave are reminiscent. It's interesting to look back at the history of things, of 2 positions that existed before the advent of generative grammar or of modern typology. At the beginning of the 50s, and no doubt they go much further back, because there are 2 approaches of scientific inquiry, in a sense. Whether you're looking for something existing outside of you, or you are not. And let me quote the words of the reviewer, Fred Householder, is an American linguist of the 50s and 60s, in his review of one of Zelig Harris's books, its Methods in Structural Linguistics, which is one of the paramount expositions of the American structuralism. And he dubs these 2 positions as the God's truth position and the hocus pocus position, which is magician type. Hocus pocus is, the etymology is not clear. I think they say it comes from Latin, hoc est corpus meus, but it's not clear. Anyway, like magician type. Now, let me just read the theory of the God's truth linguist, and I regret to say I am one, is that language has a structure, and the job of the linguist is to find out what the structure is and to describe it as clearly, economically, and elegantly as he can. The hocus pocus linguist believes or professes to believe that a language, I skip part, is a mass of incoherent formless data, and the job of the linguist is somehow to arrange and organize this mass, imposing on it some sort of structure with no pretense of truth. And of course the same holds if we replace language by faculty of language, whether there is or whether there is not. Now, like Householder, I am a God's truth linguist, it's clear by now, and I'm particularly interested in the hierarchical structure of the clause and of its major phrases. Now, the articulation of these structures is rarely looked into in detail, both in the generative camp and, I would say, also in the typological camp. The cartographic project, which started in the late 90s and which aims at looking in detail of what the fine structure of the different phrases and the sentence are. I wrote here that 11 volumes have come out within this project, pursues this line, trying to, as I said, to characterize the various hierarchical structures. Now, the knowledge we have so far is still in its infancy, meaning we still don't know a lot of things, of course. But the evidence of the last few years seems to indicate that the distinct hierarchies of functional projections that dominate, that contain the verbal phrase, the noun phrase, the adjectival phrase, the prepositional phrase, and so on, may be universal in the type of heads. I will at some point say what I mean by head and phrase. Type of heads and phrases, specifiers, modifiers that they involve in their number, in their relative scope, meaning that one is closer to the core, the noun, the verb, the preposition, than something else, which is more distant, contains a more bigger, larger constituent. And in the type of movements, this will be crucial at some point, that they admit, namely the word order that we find. Because the reconstruction of the universal structure has to deal with a very important thing, namely that we see a lot of word orders, and that's difficult to tease apart the different word orders to arrive at the unique hierarchy that underlies these different orders. And whether they realize each specifier head will come back. So to approach this question, let me begin finally with some examples of what appears to be a very pervasive parametric difference among languages. I first consider the lexicon, and then one example from the morphosyntax. I begin by just illustrating how languages can differ, very elementary, and then come back to suggest that all of the differences that we have seen are governed by the same logic, by the same pattern. So let me start with the first example. Now, Italian, or English, in fact, differs from Bulgarian in that it has two words, one for hand and one for arm, whereas Bulgarian has only one. Italian is mano, braccio, and Bulgarian is just raka. I think Russian is similar in that. Bulgarian also has one word for foot and leg. I think Russian is different here. You have two words, right? It's krak in Bulgarian. This is the first difference between these two languages. A second difference is between Italian and English. Now, English, as you know, has two, actually four, but I will ignore the male-female distinction: grandson, granddaughter, grandchild, and nephew, niece. Whereas Italian has only one word for both grandchild and niece, nephew, namely nipote. That's also in Latin. That's the second example from the substantive lexicon, namely the words that make up our contentive lexicon. Then I will give you quickly the two other differences that concern what we might call the functional or grammatical lexicon, that has to do with closed class items, which are more grammatical than just a lexicon. Another distinction between English and Italian. English, which looks like lexical, but as we will see, it's far from just that. English has three adverbs, like soon, early, and quickly, which correspond to one adverb in Italian, presto. Some of you know Italian, so you will. And that's you are given in 4 and 5 in the handout. And again, we find a case where one language differs from another in the number of lexical items that are used to express what other languages express with more like lexical items. Then let me give you the second example, a slightly more complex case of a functional lexicon having to do with negative elements. Now, these are two Italian dialects spoken in the north of Italy, One is near Turin, which is a big city to the northwest. It has two negative particles, nen, which is a neutral negative, means to negate a proposition. And then it has another, pa, which is like Italian mica, and it's a presuppositional negative marker. That means that not only it negates a certain proposition, but it negates a proposition that the speaker believes that the addressee assumes to be true. So it's actually a denial rather than a simple negation. The second dialect, which is also spoken above Turin geographically, has only one negative marker, which serves the two purposes, like French, and it's called pa, just like French. Now, I take the pattern that we just saw with the two substantive lexical elements and the two grammatical functional lexical elements, not to be an accidental variation, but to arise from a very simple fact, namely that the substantive denotata, the arm, leg, whatever, or the functional denotata, negation or something else, of language A, which correspond to unique lexical item of language B, they share something in common, as well as differentiating between each other with respect to other features. So that we can say that language B, the one which has only one term, capitalizes on the common core of the three elements that in the other language are kept separate, because that language capitalizes not on the common core alone, but especially on the differentiating elements of the. And I think it will be clear if we go fast through the examples now. So recall again that the Italian has braccio in mano, or English arm and hand, and Bulgarian only raka and krak. And what seems to be the common core element is upper limb. In Italian, braccio, arm, is upper limb minus extremity, and hand is upper limb plus extremity. So you're differentiating there one common core, but then you differentiate it with respect to another feature. And the same for leg and foot. Bulgarian, here I forgot to put also the plus or minus extremity, capitalizes on the upper limb, on what is common to arm and hand, and what is common to leg and foot, which is upper limb, lower limb, and leaves unspecified whether it has also the feature extremity or not. Consider now the other difference, Italian versus English, with respect to grandson, granddaughter, nephew, niece, and Italian only one word, nipote. Now, well, one could think that in the country that introduced the concept and practice of nepotism, it's very convenient to cover a lot of relatives under one nipote. But I think there is a more charitable and correct analysis which has exactly the same logic as the one that we just saw, namely the fact that Italian capitalizes on the common core which unites grandson, granddaughter, nephew, and niece, whereas English keeps them apart by capitalizing on the different features that go along with it. So we can represent English as in 7. So grandson, granddaughter is two lines away from the ego. So you have to go down to your children and then go down to the children of your children. So you have two lines which are plus descending minus ascending. You need both features. And if you look at nephew, niece, I again ignore the male-female distinction. There are still two lines, that separate nephew niece from the ego, yet the first line is minus descending, minus ascending, because it's horizontal. So here there is a difference in the features. And the second is descending and minus ascending. Now, the two can be put together, like Italian does, if you underspecify the first line. If you say that if, as you see in 8, the first line is plus minus descending, minus ascending, and the second line is necessarily descending. Because if you choose the plus in the first line, then you get grandson, granddaughter. If you choose the minus, then you get nephew, niece. But it's the same kind of features, only Italian underspecifies one part. Notice that one should not expect, for example, Italian to put together cousin and grandson, granddaughter, because cousin has a 3-line distance from the ego. You have to go up, then horizontally, and then go down. And so things are not as straightforward as in the case of 2 lines of distance. Let me go also now to the soon, early, quickly distinction. Let me just skip the quickly, and concentrate on the soon, early. Now, if you look at 10, you will see that depending on whether presto precedes the finite verb or follows it, or follows the non-finite one, 10a and 10b, it gets 2 different meanings. If it precedes, it's like English soon, which also has to precede or can precede, whereas if it follows, it means early. And as English, if you early cannot precede the verb. You cannot say I early woke up, but only I woke up early. And in fact, you can combine the two. You can say 11, presto si dovrà alzare presto, meaning soon he will have to wake up early. Now, this seems to show that these are not lexical quirks, but these are structural positions that correlate with interpretation of these adverbs. Now, Italian, in an older book, I sketched a very rough semantic analysis of what presto qua soon is. It's a short time, with respect to a norm, short time span after some reference time. So if it's in the past, he will have soon, or he had soon realized that, so that's in the past. With short time span after the reference time in the past, or if you say he will soon realize, it's a very short time from or after a reference time in the future. But there is this core of presto qua soon that can be more or less explicated in these terms. Now, presto qua early has something in common, because if you say he woke up early, si è alzato presto, it seems to suggest that it's a short, with respect to the norm, time span after the beginning of a scale of waking up times. So we know that there are different waking up times that go, let's say, from 6 o'clock to 9, and we generally say early if it's close to 6 rather than. So it's short time after the beginning. And what is common between soon and early is that it's a short, with respect to a norm, time span after X. And you then distinguish what X is, whether it's waking up times or whether it's a reference time. This is to say that actually, as I said earlier, it's very important to recognize the fact that what can appear as a pure lexical difference actually betrays a structural difference. So that presto not only can correspond to soon and early, but very precisely corresponds to the position that soon has in English and early has in English. So it means that they are two positions that have to be filled by something that shares a common core between the two positions. This is even clearer with the negative case that I showed earlier. So if you look at the 12 and, well, look at 12, just A and B. Now, in the Piedmontese nen, pa, which have two negative markers, they occupy different positions. This is a very good work by Zannottini, and a book actually, which came out in 1997. Nen pa has to precede ja already, whereas nen has to follow. So they don't occupy the same position. This is a always very important thing to look at, whether two things that seem alike, whether they occupy the same positions. Here they don't. The element discriminating the two positions is the adverb already. And Zannottini already gave the order pa, ja already, so negative, presuppositional, already, negative, non-presuppositional, always, and then other adverbs. And they can co-occur in the order that you expect, panen, that's 13, but not in the opposite order. Now, if you go to the other dialect, which has only one negative element, which serves the two functions, the non-presuppositional and the presuppositional negation, you discover that depending on its position with respect to already, it's interpreted as presuppositional negation or it's interpreted as simple negation. So this is shown in 14. So le pas ja parti precedes already, and it has this presuppositional kind of interpretation, as Zannottini says, whereas if it follows, it has the simple negation. So that leads to the following conclusion that you see in 15. So that structurally, there are two dedicated positions, one for simple negation, non-presuppositional negation, what I call F2, which follows the adverb already, and then another position, F1, which is both negation, pure negation, plus this presuppositional addition of the. Now, the two languages then turn out to differ very simply. They have the same syntax, but the lexicon, which puts together in one the two functions, is underspecified. So the second dialect has the Valdo 10, which you see there, has only one element, pa, and French is the same. Pa can appear before and after déjà, and it has these two different meanings too. So it's purely negation P and plus or minus presupposed. Whereas in Piedmontese of Turin, you have pa and nen, which are specialized for just being negative P or being negative P plus P presupposed. So you see that you can tease apart what is common and what is different between the two dialects. What is crucial is that these are functions that are represented syntactically in different positions. So that's very important. Now, the different structural location of the functional categories that we have just seen with the negation is a general, I think, characteristic of all functional categories. In fact, in an outrageously rich array of such functional elements as you see in 16a, in an older book, I have tried to put them in order, in the scope order, so that mood, tense, various modals, various aspects, voice, in fact there are various voices. They seem to come in a specific order with respect to each other, and if you put them together, something that you never find in any language, where you don't have like 30 suffixes to give you the whole array of these elements, yet you find that those languages that are poor in functional grammatical elements on the verb can express the same distinctions through adverbs. So that you have actually, and the adverbs are ordered in the same way. So an adverb like probably comes before a manner adverb or another type of adverb in English before the verb. Or in Russian, there are also different orders of adverbs. Has to be careful about what exact meaning one takes and so on. So this is to say that one can really push to the limit this cartographic sort of project in trying to figure out what the complex structure of the sentence is, and the same holds, we will see something at the end of the nominal phrase, which also is very rich. And in that work, I made a mistake. I thought that the adverbs set, if you know something about X-bar theory, you have this is the basic atom of syntactic structures. Here you have the specifier, here you have the head, and here you have the complement. And if you repeat this structure over and over again, you get a very large structure which underlies the sentence, for example. If you have, let's say, a modal, head, and then a complement to the modal which contains a lexical or another modal or whatever, you come up with very large structure. And I thought that the adverbs were actually here in a specifier head relation to in the same atom, in the same element. But that cannot be the case. That was based on English, for example, or Italian, where you seem to see adjacency between the two. So you can say 17, A or B. This strategy necessarily must consider, where necessarily is somehow an adverbial related to must, the ontic modal, or in 17b, it may possibly be worth, where you can also say it possibly may, but then the verb may overtake the adverb and move a little bit further. But that cannot be right. And I discovered that later, because there are, especially head final languages, where there are elements that intervene between the verb and plus suffixes that denote a certain aspect or modality, and the corresponding adverb. So if you look at German 18, you see that in between the adverb and the verb which goes with it, it's again a deontic kind of modal, you can have some other material that clearly has moved from behind the modal, from a lower position than the modal, namely the VP, to the left of the modal, in between the modal and the adverbial. So a more correct case would be that in 19, which we will see tomorrow more effectively represented, where the two projections are a paired projection interrupted by some functional position that allows things to move there. And this is part of the system that should derive the different word orders in head initial and head final languages. We'll see that. And of course, languages differ as to whether they only show some aspect within the verb, grammaticalizing the verb. One case is 20a with Makushi, it's an Amerindian language, where this aspect, what the author calls finally. So it's a suffix that is added to the verb to mean this kind of aspect that we render, at least Italian and English, with an adverb. There is no suffix that signals this meaning of, oh, finally I did it, or something like that. And of course, there are languages where you can combine the verb, you can use just the verb, you can use just the adverb, or you can use both, as in English in 21, where you can combine may with possibly and may possibly. So, it seems that really one can go a long way to discover what is the underlying structure, although that really requires a lot of work, some of which has to be done still. It's not so. Now let me give you, how much time do I have now for the first?
I think about
32 minutes.
Half an hour.
22 minutes?
No,
32.
32 minutes. Plenty of time, okay. Some discussion of the progressive aspect. Now, this is one aspect that, like many others, I'll say something about the perfect later, that I think shows very clearly that we have to, that we can go directly from the language particular facts to the, in the best possible case, not always it's so straightforward, of course, it requires a lot of work, to the universal category. Now, the semanticists are, they don't worry too much. They talk about progressive operator. Now, if you look at languages, you can almost say that no language has exactly, I don't know, of course, but it's even possible that no language has exactly the same way of expressing the progressive aspect. But that doesn't matter really, because you can try to delve into the various meanings and the various ways in which it can be expressed to come up to what the core of progressive means. Now, this is difficult, so you will bear with me. Now, in 22, I gave one definition. Actually, it's one of the first definitions given by Bennett and Partee of the progressive aspect. It has later been refined in some little ways, but doesn't really matter now. Now, what is the progressive? Progressive operator, they said, is true at a point or interval I, if and only if there exists a bigger interval, an interval I prime, which contains I, and I is not final subinterval, in which a certain event is true at the bigger interval. So essentially, it's a way of, let me cite Jespersen's basic insight that said in a non-formal way, non-semantically formal way, that the progressive aspect is a temporal frame encompassing some reference time. It means that you can use in English, he is running, if now, that's the reference time in this case, or he was running, then the reference time is in the past, and his running preceded and follows that particular point, or at least under an inertia world where because there are then semantic problems where if you are crossing a street, it's not obvious that you end up to the other side if a car runs you over. So you have to put in a number of, but essentially there is a reference point or interval which is within a bigger interval where the same action goes on. And you have to say that it's some kind of activity. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with Wendler's, it's another philosopher of language, semanticist, distinction, classification of verbs into activities, like he's running, he's working, accomplishments, he is writing a poem, and with this, it is said that progressive periphrasis is possible in English. It's not possible with states in English. For example, you cannot say, we are being mortal, or we are knowing that you will be here tomorrow. And neither with achievements, which have an instantaneous endpoint. So he is finding the wallet. You cannot say that in English. Now, English, as compared to, let's say, Italian, as compared, I will cite a case of Chinese and Thai, has extended, so this is what people generally say, has extended the coverage of the periphrasis in a way that may obscure the facts. Now, if you take non-instantaneous achievements, namely achievements that have preparatory stages, so finding a wallet has no preparatory stage. You simply find it or you don't find it. But if you are landing with a plane, or if you are reaching a place, there are preparatory stages before you actually land or before you actually reach the place. And now English allows, and Italian, allows the progressive periphrasis to be used with such verbs. So you can say, John is leaving, John is arriving, the plane is landing, with a particular interpretation, which is called prospective, namely, is about to. So when you say the plane is landing, you're saying that is in the preparatory stage of landing and is about to land. Or I am arriving, I'm not there yet. I'm in the preparatory stage of arriving, and it means I'm about to be there. Now, there are languages that don't allow this coverage, which, as I said, forces a prospective interpretation. And if we, for example, Chinese, the progressive marker, Tsai, is impossible with all achievements, so you cannot say Wang is dying, which you can say in Italian, you can say in English, but not in Chinese. And so all achievements are out. Now, Thai makes you feel, or at least tempts you, to see what happens. Namely, if you look at Thai, the progressive aspect particle, which is kamla, in footnote 6, can co-occur with the prospective aspect particle following it. This is very common across languages. Many languages allow the expression of these two aspects together, and it's always the case that the progressive particle is higher up than the prospective. It's not clear why, but semantics is true. So it's tempting to think that English or Italian, but not Chinese, are closer to Thai in having a silent, in activating a silent prospective to allow you to put the progressive periphrases with achievement verbs. Otherwise, if you don't activate that, you are not allowed to use the pure progressive with achievement. So I don't know if this is clear, but at least I think one starts seeing ways to reconcile what appear at first simple differences, capricious differences among languages. Now, I won't go into the various details about the differences that I put in 24 between the Italian progressive periphrases and the English progressive periphrases. English is much more liberal. What does that mean? Well, apart from two cases which are very simply, for example, that we cannot use essere, be in the gerund, which is part of Italian. The Italian periphrases is to stay plus the lexical verb with the gerundive form. So it's like Spanish, está bailando. So we say, which is close to he's at doing something. So be cannot, is a stative verb, cannot be found within this periphrases. But more interesting is 24C and C prime, because in English you can say they have been fishing for 3 hours, fine. Now if you try to do that in Italian, it's impossible. Why is that? Now, what you find is that Italian has another way of expressing that. We use a slightly different periphrasis, which is stare plus a. So you say loro sono stati a pescare. Instead of using the gerundive form, you use another, which corresponds to what semanticists call durative progressive, as opposed to focalized progressive. So semanticists have come to the conclusion that there is not one simple progressive aspect, but you have at least to distinguish two types. And English seems to use the same periphrases to express the two types. Italian, this time, has more options and has to use two periphrases, whereas English uses one. And I don't go over the other differences, which also have to do with what are called progressive, resultative progressive. So something which is doing, but then continues on. Where English, again, seems to use the same periphrases, the same morphology. But this is morphology. That's a very trivial thing. Now, there are even differences among standard English and other varieties of English. If you look at 25, you see that, for example, in Indian English, possibly due to substrate or something else, they can say, I was not knowing these facts, which is completely impossible in standard English. Or are you wanting anything to mean, do you want anything? What does that mean? Well, in that particular variant of English, the progressive periphrasis has taken over something much, other aspects. In this particular case, it has taken over, one can see that, the purely imperfective aspect. So that with the imperfective, you do not have any problem in using the imperfective with stative verbs. So even in English, you can say they knew, they used to know in the past, and there is no problem. So that seems to suggest the following, namely that languages differ in the same way that we saw earlier. So even for aspectual, but also for modal, and for any functional element, one language may use a morphology that actually covers more than one universal category. You don't see it immediately, but you have to dig and see whether it works. I mean, if the difficult question is how to arrive at the precise universal categories, namely the durative progressive, the focal progressive, and the resultative progressive. I will also give you one case with the perfect, and then more or less stop. But let me cite one case of a language which I think is like Russian, in this particular case Bulgarian, which has no progressive periphrases. So what they use is the simple present or the imperfective past. To say what in English you have to say, for example, if you look at 26, to say in London it's raining a lot, it means right now it's raining, they use rains a lot. In English you cannot say in London it rains a lot to mean it's raining now. It only means usually it rains a lot, it's in the perfective. And the same with the past in 27. Now, Italian and French are like English with the differences that we saw, or that I hinted at, and like Bulgarian, because in Italian we can say it is raining right now, or we can say it rains right now. Piove, adesso meaning it's raining. And Bulgarian uses, what does that mean? Bulgarian uses the same morphological form to cover a lot of things. It covers generic tense, habitual tense, progressive aspect, and so on. So it's a pure morphological difference. It's not anything connected to the universal categories that we have to discover, and which is difficult to discover. So the idea now, let me go, I gave in 32A and 32B two possible representations of what happens between Italian or English, no, here Italian, and Bulgarian. Namely, you have the lexical verb, which has a nominalizing suffix, the gerundive. Then you have the exponent of the progressive aspect, which is the verb stay, which has to raise then to the present or the past, and then to agreement, left out. In Bulgarian, you simply do not have morphology for that. But it would be very strange to say that Bulgarian has no, understands differently from Italian or from English when you say it rains. You have to, Bulgarians have to decide whether what is meant is a progressive aspect, kind of utterance, or a generic utterance. So they have the same distinction, only that they use the same morphological form. And the same is true, in fact, for the so-called perfect. Let me give you just two very quick examples. Now, in many grammars of English, you find a lot of finer distinctions. They say there is a hot news perfect, there is a resultative perfect, there is an experiential perfect. It seems that these are like any language can choose whatever to have. But you see that these kind of distinctions that grammarians or logicians or semanticians have arrived at have an expression, morphological expression in some language, but not in other. So if you take what I think is Indonesian in 33, in this grammar, I think I hope I'm not mistaken. Or some form of Indonesian, given that it's
It's in the footnote.
yeah, Indonesian. At least Grange is cited here probably. No, I didn't report it in the, I mean, it's a grammar. And he says that Indonesian, or that variety of Indonesian, has two particles. One he calls the perfect particle, and the other which adds the experiential part. So what is the experiential perfect? Is when you say, oh, I've been to America, or oh, I've seen the Pope, meaning just that you need to have seen it once. And it's like saying, I had this experience. And in fact, even English, now, Indonesian shows that the experiential component of the perfect is lower or is closer to the verb than the core perfect. Something that you cannot see in another dialect of Italy, close to Venice, which uses two auxiliaries to express the experiential perfect. So they say, I have had seen the Pope, to mean, oh, I've seen the Pope. They have to use two auxiliaries. And we don't know which one has the function of the experience, which one has the simple. But if we put together Indonesian and Vicentino, this dialect, then we know that the second has to be the experiential part, if it's putatively the same. And that's more or less the same pattern that we saw with progressive. Now, at the end, I just wanted to show what we are going to see in 36. That's a fragment of the extended projection of the noun phrase, which actually is even bigger than what you see here. And we'll see that there are many things that have to be put into it. Okay, I'll stop here, and if there are questions or... Sorry?
11 more minutes. 11 more minutes.
We still have some time.
We have some time.
Yeah, yeah,
I think we can use it.
yes.
No, I thought to leave like 10 minutes for discussion. And if you have, I mean, if something was not clear, if you have doubts about this enterprise, if you have counterexamples, maybe, or that would be interesting.
I have a small question which is not really related to the subject. You mentioned something called the resultative progressive. Can you explain what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a difference that you see between English and Italian, and that I have it in some. So in English you can say the statue was lying on the floor, as well as the statue lies on the floor. Now, in Italian you cannot say sta giacendo. You can only say giace. So only the present can be used. And that has been claimed to be a special case of a temporary resultative effect of the progressive, as opposed to the permanent. So there is a difference in meaning. If you say the statue lies on the floor, it means that that is normal place. If you say the statue is lying on the floor, it could be that it's just there for 5 minutes and then they take it away, or it's not its normal place. And there are languages, let me see if where they actually mention the fact that, for example, in this Austronesian language, Buol, they also cite a resultative progressive aspect formed by reduplication to express ongoing resulting states. So, could be that this is not exactly the same case as English, but again, one should be very careful about making these fine distinctions before drawing, conclusions about the existence of just one progressive aspect. I mean, these things seem to call for a cognitive type of explanation. I mean, surely all languages express what our cognition interprets the world. And for some reason, our cognition has subtle ways of looking at things that you could imagine we could do without. And there are also things that you don't find. So Chomsky, for example, would, in his later thinking, has come to the position where very little is left in universal grammar. And he's right, I'm sure, about external, something depends on cognition, something depends even on physical laws, as he says, the third factor. But there is something missing, namely that not everything that is in our cognition is encoded grammatically in the languages of the world. So what does that mean? You have diminutives, all languages have diminutives of one form or another, but you don't have dangerositives or perilositives, namely suffixes that tell you that something is dangerous. It would be very useful to a child to have a suffix that says, wait, watch out, because this is dangerous. But you never come across a language which makes this distinction. So this means that universal grammar has crystallized one part of our cognition, probably, in expressing grammatically certain notions and disregarding completely other notions, which are important for life, like love, hate, death. They don't seem to come into grammar at all. And again, that's one should ask why is it the case? It's a bigger question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was going to ask a totally different question, but your comment now put me on alert, because there is a category apprehensive, which is specifically about something dangerous and to be avoided. And it's very commonly used towards children, of course, as you said.
How is it expressed?
It's expressed in different languages by different ways. In some languages by a suffix on the verb. In some languages by special construction, apparently more or less grammaticalized, but that's really widespread. It's like there is a recent project on apprehensives. I think that they are tested in many dozens of languages. So this probably is not very good example. So in a sense, dangerous. Yeah, it's not about nouns. It's not about objects. It's about situations.
Yeah.
But it's
maybe I didn't. Yeah, I was thinking. As we will see, diminutives occupy and endearing suffixes, and augmentatives occupy a specific position within the nominal phrase.
Right.
So my question is this apprehensive ever found within a noun phrase?
No. Well, not that I know of. At least. I was talking about
That's
the
also something interesting to, I didn't say clearly, that certain things typically come up grammaticalized on verbs, and certain other things, of course, come up typically on nominal phrases, and some on both. For example, plurality, which means iterativity in verbs and iteration of items and the noun. But I would be very interested in seeing how this apprehensive.
Yeah, I can give you
Is
some
there
reference.
something written in English?
Yes, there, okay, I'll check it up and
Yeah.
give you the reference. And I just thought that augmentatives actually are closely connected to dangerous things. I mean, augmentatives often express the same meaning of danger as opposed to diminutives. So this is another kind of counter argument to the point. So it's within the noun phrase. It's a category cognitively probably tightly connected to augmentatives. Yeah.
Well, I would be very curious to see that.
But my question actually was different. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sense a little bit. I just missing something about examples 33 and 34 because you're glossing it and also putting in the tree as a combination, as far as I understood, probably I'm wrong, as a combination of two different categories. First, perfective or perfect, the other one experiential, and this is a bit, that's something which I cannot parse actually, because usually when they speak about experiential perfect, that's a single category, that's one of the interpretation of the perfect itself. And exactly, you give this as a translation of the Italian example. It happened to me to see the Pope. I've seen the Pope. While where you're saying there are two different categories, perfect and experiential, it would seem that you first apply experiential and then you put it into the perfect, which is not the case, because the experiential is something happening which happens to you now. So I don't really see how the example, I don't know what to say about example 33, because you're saying I've had the experience of being cheated, so it might be that the whole situation has been put into the past. But in the case that is translated in 34 from Italian, I've seen the Pope, it happened to me to see the Pope, that, or at least I've seen the Pope, seems to be a situation in the present, so I currently have an experience of someone who saw the Pope. So I can't see why it should be projected to two different nodes in the tree.
Right. Well, as to the last point, I think that it's very close, although I gave two different glosses. Also, 34a, as far as I was told, means I had the experience of. And when you say, I have seen the Pope, now this also has to do with another difference between English perfect and, let's say, Italian perfect. I don't know about Russian perfect. Namely, with the English perfect, it's the current relevance perfect, which is yet another one. You cannot say, I have seen John yesterday, completely out. In Italian, you can, because actually, it seems that our perfect is connected to anterior tense, which almost is a past tense, although anterior combines with the past tense to give you the pluperfect. So again, there are at least 4 or 5 different types of perfects. Now the question is, do they or how do they combine? Because maybe they cannot all combine freely. That is something that semanticians should tell us. Now, what I did here in an artisan type of way is to look at this combination in Indonesian and also putting it together with what the French call the surcomposé construction, where they also have 2 auxiliaries in a slightly different way. They use for a different type of aspect. But in this particular dialect, it looks as if it's pure experiential perfect. Now, your very good question is, but if they are separate, and the fact that you have 2 auxiliaries shows that you have 2 heads there. It must be that, I mean, at least it makes it plausible to have 2 distinct positions, because you have either 2 particles or 2 auxiliaries. Now, Italian has only one, so the interpretation, although we have the same interpretation, putatively, of Vicentino or Indonesian, it means that morphologically we are impoverished and we use one suffix which combines the two heads, the two functional heads. That's the idea. And the very good question is, what happens if instead of the past, can you have the experience in the present? Probably yes. I don't, I'm not aware of a special morphology in the present to express something like, oh, he's, oh, I see him. I mean, I have the experience of seeing him.
Can I try to specify a little bit the question? Well, what I know about experiential perfect, the description of experiential perfect in the literature, is that actually it's a statement about the present. It's a state in the present of something that happened to you in the past. So if you have two heads, one which is called experiential and the second perfect, I would expect it to be something, a state in the past, which was parallel to the experiential perfect in the present. So, and I now beginning to understand you mean differently here. So you're saying that experiential is a separate meaning; it's not a perfect. So for you, experiential perfect is actually a composite category coming from experiential, which is. But then the problem is exactly as you said. If experiential is a separate category, then why don't we have these categories like I am seeing him? It looks like a mirative a little bit, but it's not connected to the mirative.
The mirative is unexpectedness.
Right,
isn't
right.
it?
So,
Yeah.
so if you're saying that experiential perfect comprises two heads, or semantically comprises two notions that are combined in some way, then we would expect at least to see it separately experiential.
Yeah, that's you're right. And I don't know, I haven't seen it dissociated from the past.
Right.
I mean, from past morphology. It could be that when you say it's a past experience that relates to the present, whether it also combines in those cases with the so-called current relevance perfect of the English type, so that you should be able to tell by combination with the past time adverb. If it cannot, then it's present. I mean, you cannot say vado ieri, I go yesterday. So if it's really a present, you should not be able to combine it with the past time adverb. And I don't know whether the language, if it can, then maybe it combines the current relevance perfect, whatever that means, really. I don't know exactly semantically what the fine distinctions are between all these types of perfects. My hunch is that, I mean, looking, I don't know, I mean, this is a very personal take, namely that we should make much finer distinctions than we are used to make at the universal level, and not be confused by the fact that the morphology puts these together. So languages seem to cut the cake in a different way, but it's the same cake. That's the idea. And that remains as a possibility way to go. But I mean, there are full of problems, as you know.
So thank you. I think we should stop here for 10 minutes. So